To build muscle and get stronger, you have to train hard. This is not a controversial take. But how hard exactly? Should you leave some reps in reserve, or should you go to failure in every set? Before I answer this question, I have to introduce you to the second training principle, overload. The scientific definition of overload states that for training to be effective, it has to both be within the maximal threshold of the system being trained and be higher in magnitude than the recent stimuli. In other words, training has to be both hard and getting harder over time. But why? Why can't we build muscle and get stronger with training that feels extremely easy? Because for adaptations to occur, a disruption of homeostasis is needed, which leads to a cascade of molecular events that cause adaptive processes to activate and elicit system improvements in muscle size and force production. In other words, your body will build muscle and get stronger only if it has a reason to. Okay, training has to be hard, but why does it also need to be getting harder over time? Why can't we train just as hard in each session and see great results? Because when your body adapts, it gets better at resisting disruption, so the next stimulus must be greater than when originally presented, so that it may elicit a similar disruptive effect and thus a similarly large adaptive response. In other words, as you build muscle and get stronger, more absolute stimulus is needed to keep the relative stimulus stable. Okay, so the overload principle states that for training to be effective, it has to be both hard and getting harder over time. But what does hard training even mean? How hard you're training refers to how close to failure are your working sets or your relative effort. If you're leaving 10 reps in reserve, you're warming up. But if you're going to failure, you're training extremely hard. Okay, but how can you measure relative effort? By either using RPE, which stands for rating of perceived exertion, or RAR, which stands for reps in reserve. By using RPE, you rate how hard the set was on a scale of 1 to 10. But by using RAR, you simply estimate how many more reps you could have done. Okay, but which one of these should you use? A general recommendation is to use RPE for sets below 10 reps and RAR for sets above 10 reps. This is because RPE at high rep sets simply gets confusing, while RAR for low rep sets just doesn't make any sense. What's the RPE of a set of 27 or RAR of a set of 2? Each unit is such a big fraction of the work being done that it gets difficult to measure your relative effort, so make sure to use RPE for sets below 10 reps and RAR for sets above 10 reps. Okay, so now that you know what hard training is and how to measure how hard you're training, let's finally answer the main question. How hard should you train? The short answer would be as hard as you need to maximize your stimulus to fatigue ratio, or in other words, to maximize the stimulus while minimizing fatigue. Stimulus is all of the good things you get from training that result in adaptations, while fatigue is all of the bad things you get from training that result in decreased performance. The better this ratio is, the more productive your training is. Okay, but how do you maximize your stimulus to fatigue ratio in regards to relative effort? By pushing yourself hard enough to stimulate adaptations, but also not so hard as to cause needless fatigue. Generally, hard training is estimated to begin at around RP7 or RR3 and end at the scale's limit, RP10 or RR0. This means that RP7 equals RER3, RP8 equals RER2, RP9 equals RER1, and RP10 equals RER0. I'll be using RPEs throughout this video, so if you're using RAR, you can easily translate them like this. Since the starting point of hard training is around RP7, that's where you should start your mesocycle. This is because after a deload, your body is super sensitive to training. It doesn't require anything harder for adaptations to take place. Going harder would increase the stimulus, but it would also increase the fatigue exponentially, and thus decrease the stimulus to fatigue ratio. To illustrate this, take a look at this graph. The blue line is the stimulus, and the orange line is the fatigue. Very easy training does generate some fatigue, but it isn't really all that stimulative, so the stimulus to fatigue ratio isn't great. However, as you approach RP7, training becomes exponentially more stimulative while still being linearly more fatiguing, so your stimulus to fatigue ratio becomes better. But as you train even harder, the stimulus still slightly increases, but the fatigue increases exponentially, so your stimulus to fatigue ratio becomes worse. Of course, this graph isn't perfect and doesn't represent reality 100% of the time. It's just a model to show you why leaving some reps in reserve might be a better idea than going to failure all the time. The main thing that we can conclude from this graph is that RP7 training is the most productive training in regards to the stimulus to fatigue ratio. But does this mean that we should just train RP7 indefinitely? Not exactly. Sure, RP7 training has the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, but since the principle of overload necessitates that your training must get harder over time, staying at RP7 becomes counterproductive for long-term progress. To illustrate this, take a look at this graph, in which you can see the stimulus to fatigue ratio for each RP target in each successive week of a 4-week-long mesocycle. In week 1, RP7 has the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio because your body is really sensitive to training, but with each successive week, the RP target with the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio increases to 8 in the second week, 9 in the third week, and 10 in the fourth week. This is because your body gets more resistant to training and requires more stimulus for further adaptations. So to keep your stimulus to fatigue ratio as high as it can be, your relative effort should slowly increase through your mesocycle. Another thing that this graph shows is that the absolute stimulus to fatigue ratio is lower with each successive week. The stimulus to fatigue ratio of RP10 training in week 4 is not even half of that of RP7 training in week 1. The stimulus might very well be higher, but since fatigue is exponentially higher, the stimulus to fatigue ratio is worse. This is for two reasons. RP10 training doesn't have a good stimulus to fatigue ratio by itself, and your cumulative fatigue is really high. Cumulative fatigue is the fatigue that you've accumulated over the previous weeks of training, which basically means that the longer you train, the worse your stimulus to fatigue ratio gets. This is why it's so important to take deloads to drop your cumulative fatigue and resensitize your body to training. Otherwise, your training will cause a lot of fatigue, but not much stimulus, which is the opposite of what you want. In short, you're simply not going to be able to train productively without also increasing your relative effort. This means that while we should start our mesocycles at RP7, we shouldn't stay at RP7. Our relative effort should increase, otherwise we'd violate the principle of overload and fail to make any meaningful progress. But by how much? By 0.5 to 1 unit per week. This means that if you start your mesocycle at RP7, it should take you roughly 4 to 8 weeks until you reach RP10. And once you do, you should take a deload to resensitize your body to training and repeat this process all over again. If you take nothing away from this video, please take away this last sentence, as it's the foundation of strength and hypertrophy training. You simply start at the lowest end of the productive relative effort range, slowly increase your relative effort until you reach the end of it, deload and repeat. It's really that simple. Okay, but what does increasing relative effort even mean? There are many ways in which you can make your training harder, but the most common ones are load and rep increases, since they're the easiest to measure. This means that to make your training harder, you should do more reps or lift more weight. If your goal is to get stronger, you should primarily aim to increase the load, as load is the main driver of strength. But if your goal is to build muscle, it doesn't really matter whether you choose to increase the reps or load, as volume is the main driver of muscle growth, which consists of sets, reps, and load. You can also increase your sets, but since relative effort doesn't really represent how many sets you do, that's a topic for another video. Keep in mind that your relative effort should increase slowly. Don't lift 100 pounds at RP7 in the first week and 130 pounds at RP10 in the second, because that will mess up your whole progression scheme. Since RP should increase by 0.5 to 1 unit per week, you should increase the load by roughly 5 to 10 pounds or your rep count by 1 to 3 reps. How aggressively you increase these variables depends on the length of your mesocycle and your training age. If you're running a 4-week-long mesocycle and are still a beginner, you can increase the load or reps relatively quickly. But if you're running an 8-week-long mesocycle and are advanced, you can barely increase the load or reps. Otherwise, you'll simply hit RP10 halfway through your mesocycle. This is why beginners should typically run longer mesocycles and advanced should run shorter ones, so that you don't increase your risk of injury by increasing the load so quickly or waste your time by adding 1 pound to an exercise every week. And now for the final part of the video. This is not the only way of training. You can certainly make great gains by ending your mesocycles under RP10 or starting them above RP7. This RP7 to 10 method just makes the most sense when really questioned. For example, ending below RP10 and never going to failure poses 3 problems. The first is that it's hard to tell how far away from failure you really are if you've never trained to failure. This is especially true for beginners, who are known for saying they're training at RP9 when really they're training at RP7. Going to failure at the end of your mesocycle simply gives you a clear point of reference that you can use for further mesocycles. If you did 10 reps at RP10, you're simply not going to conclude that you should start your next mesocycle at 5 reps. The second is that it's harder to see if you're making progress. The most objective way of telling if you've made progress is going to failure and comparing it to the previous time you went to failure. In this case, last mesocycle. If you never reach failure, you can never be sure if you really made progress or you just tried a bit harder, which makes this whole process much more subjective than it needs to be. And the third is that you simply leave gains on the table for no good reason. Sure, the stimulus to fatigue ratio of RP10 training isn't ideal, but since you'll be taking a deload next week, fatigue isn't really a concern anymore. The raw stimulus magnitude of RP10 training is the highest out of all RPEs, and if fatigue isn't a concern for you, which it isn't at the end of a mesocycle, not going to failure means that you're skipping out on possibly the most stimulative part of the mesocycle. By ending your mesocycles at RP10, all 3 of these problems are solved. You know how far away from failure you are because you consistently approach it at the end of your mesocycles. You know if you're making progress because your relative effort is objectively the same when you're measuring it, RP10, and you squeeze everything you can out of the mesocycle by ending it when increasing your performance becomes untenable. Okay, but what about starting above RP7 and always training super hard? The first problem with this approach is that you miss out on the easiest training with the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio. As you saw in this graph, RP7 training in week 1 has the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio out of all the weeks. This is because RP7 training generally isn't all that fatiguing for how stimulative it is, and on top of that, the deload just prior to this mesocycle resensitizes your body to training by a large margin, so starting above RP7 just doesn't make all that much sense. Sure, the raw stimulus magnitude of training above RP7 is higher, but the fatigue is exponentially higher, so the small bit of extra stimulus is just not worth a huge amount of extra fatigue. The second is that you'll be forced to deload more frequently due to chronically high levels of fatigue, which will result in less time spent training or more time spent recovering. Sure, you can counter this by doing less volume, but since less volume means less stimulus, reducing your volume doesn't really change anything because your relative effort is simply too high. By starting your mesocycles at RP7, all of these problems problems are solved. You take advantage of the high stimulus to fatigue ratio of RP7 training, and you can deload less frequently, which results in more time spent making gains and less time recovering. Okay, so starting at RP7 and ending at RP10 is likely the most optimal way of training. But how does training like this actually look? This should go without saying, but it's impossible to accurately estimate your RPE. Some days you will feel really strong, while some days you will feel really weak, so you shouldn't be constantly estimating your RPE, as it'll lead to errors in your training program design. The only point at which you need to estimate your RPE is at the beginning of a mesocycle. If you went to failure in the previous mesocycle with the same exercises, you will roughly know how many reps or how much load is RP7. But if you didn't, you'll just have to guess. When a stat starts to feel challenging, end it. RP7 training is meant to be challenging, but it shouldn't be anything too crazy. If you find yourself struggling to get the last reps, you're likely training over RP7. But if the set didn't feel like a challenge whatsoever, you're likely training under RP7. Now that you know your starting point, you have to just increase your reps or load by a little bit each week. Eventually, we'll reach RP10 and you simply won't be able to do more reps or lift more weight. When this happens, take a deload and rinse and repeat. This is the easiest way of applying these concepts to training, as guesstimating your RPE each week can get really tough. Was this really RP8 or was it RP9? It doesn't matter because you'll never know. If you were able to do more reps or lift more weight than last week, that's all that matters. And once you're no longer able to do that, training no longer makes sense and deloading is the only logical step forward, or rather backward, which will give you the opportunity to take 3 steps forward. I hope that this video helped you understand how hard you should be training, and if it did, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like, subscribe to my channel, and commenting down below what kind of videos you would like to see from me more. And have an awesome day. Peace!